Hello everyone and welcome to Scary Reddit Stories channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. And so, before you drift off, you could leave me a comment to know where you are listening around the world. And if you have not subscribed to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell if you enjoy the episodes. I used to love visiting my grandparents' old house when I was a kid. It stood at the edge of a forest, a sprawling, creaky Victorian mansion that had been in our family for generations. As a child, it felt like an adventure. There were endless rooms to explore, secret nooks and crannies, and the comforting smell of old wood and lavender that lingered in every corner. But after what I found in that house last week, I'll never go back. I haven't slept since. It all started when my grandparents passed away a few months ago. My family decided to sell the house, and I offered to help clear it out. I hadn't been there in years, but stepping inside again brought back a wave of nostalgia. The familiar staircase, the grand piano in the living room, and the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. It was like stepping back in time, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the silence, or the way the shadows seemed to stretch a little too long in the fading daylight. I brushed it off as my imagination and got to work. While sorting through the attic, I stumbled upon something I'd never seen before. A small, wooden door in the corner of the room, partially hidden behind a stack of old trunks. It was strange because I'd spent countless hours playing in that attic as a kid, and I'd never noticed it before. The door was different from the others in the house. It was older, the wood dark and warped, and it had a strange symbol carved into it, a circle with 3 intersecting lines. It looked ancient, like something out of a medieval book. Curiosity got the better of me. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, and there was no key in sight. After some rummaging, I found a rusty old key in a nearby drawer, and to my surprise, it fit perfectly. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down, farther down than it should have. The house only had 2 floors, and the basement was on the other side of the house. This staircase didn't make sense. Every rational part of me screamed to close the door and walk away, but I was too curious. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, stepping cautiously down the steps. The air grew colder with each step. The smell of damp earth filled my nostrils, and the walls narrowed, pressing in on me. Finally, I reached the bottom, and my flashlight beam illuminated a small, stone room. It looked like a ritual chamber. There were symbols etched into the walls, similar to the one on the door, and in the center of the room stood a large, stone altar. On it sat a wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, covered in dust. I hesitated before stepping closer. Something about the box felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. But again, my curiosity won out. I reached out and opened it. Inside was a set of old, black and white photographs. They were faded, but I could make out the images clearly enough. They showed people standing in front of the house, but their faces were scratched out, leaving behind eerie, faceless figures. The last photo stopped me cold. It was a picture of me. I was standing in front of the house, holding my grandmother's hand, but my face, just like the others, had been scratched out. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. The box slipped from my hands, and the photos scattered across the floor. That's when I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I strained to listen, I realized it was coming from the walls. Faint, distant voices, whispering in a language I didn't recognize. I grabbed my phone and bolted back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it, shoving a trunk in front of it for good measure. For the rest of the day, I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined it. Stress, exhaustion, an overactive imagination. It had to be one of those things. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. And then I heard the whispers again. They were faint at first, just a soft murmuring coming from the attic. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, more insistent. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing in the darkness. At some point, I must have drifted off to sleep, but I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my door. Slow, deliberate footsteps, pacing up and down the hallway. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew I was alone in the house, or at least I was supposed to be. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed to the door, pressing my ear against it. The footsteps stopped, and then a knock. 3 soft, deliberate knocks. I held my breath, too scared to move. The door handle rattled, as if someone was trying to open it, but it was locked. The knocking grew more urgent, more frantic, until it was pounding. I backed away, my hands shaking. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The knocking stopped, and then, from the other side of the door, I heard a voice, my grandmother's voice. "Let me in, sweetheart." I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I was a wreck. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that it was just my grief playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with the house. I spent the day packing up my grandparents' belongings, trying to stay busy. But no matter where I went in the house, I felt that presence, an unseen watcher, lurking just out of sight. As the sun began to set, I decided to call it a day. But as I made my way to the front door, something caught my eye. A shadow figure, standing at the top of the staircase. It was tall and humanoid, but its features were blurry, like it was made of smoke. It stood there, unmoving, watching me. I froze, my heart pounding. The figure tilted its head, as if curious. Then, it took a step forward. I bolted out the front door, slamming it behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The shadow figure was standing in the window, watching me leave. I should have left. I should have never gone back. But something kept pulling me back to that house. The whispers, the photos, the shadow figure. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I needed to solve. So the next night, I returned. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I made my way back to the attic. The hidden door was still there, the symbol on its surface glowing faintly in the darkness. I pried it open and descended the stairs once more. The ritual chamber was just as I had left it, but this time, there was something waiting for me. A woman, standing by the altar. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow and black. She wore a tattered dress, and her hair hung in stringy, matted clumps. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice echoing off the stone walls. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. She tilted her head, just like the shadow figure had. "We've been waiting for you," she said. "The house remembers, and it never lets go." As she stepped closer, I noticed something horrifying. Her face was scratched out, just like in the photos. I turned and ran, the whispers rising to a deafening roar around me. As I reached the top of the stairs, the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The last thing I remember is screaming as the shadows closed in around me. I woke up in my car, parked at the edge of the forest. I don't remember how I got there, but I was covered in scratches and bruises. My phone was dead, and the house was nowhere in sight. When I returned with the police, the house was gone, as if it had never existed. But I know the truth. The house is still out there, waiting for its next victim. And if you ever come across an old Victorian mansion at the edge of a forest with a strange, carved door, don't open it. This is the end of Story 1. Story 2. It all started with a bad decision. A shortcut through the woods that I thought would save me time. I should have known better. The townspeople had warned me about those woods, but I thought their stories were just local folklore meant to scare outsiders. Now, I know better. If you're reading this, I hope you take my story as a warning. I had just moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere, seeking peace and quiet after the chaos of city life. The town was quaint, the people friendly, but there was always an underlying tension whenever the woods were mentioned. "Stay on the main roads," they'd say. "Don't wander into the woods after dark." I shrugged it off. Superstition, I thought. One evening, I stayed late at work. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and I realized I had a long walk home. The main road would take me an hour, but a path through the woods would cut that time in half. I stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the dark, tangled trees. "It's just a shortcut," I told myself. Nothing to be afraid of. I stepped onto the path, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots breaking the eerie silence. The further I went, the darker it became. The trees pressed in on both sides, their gnarled branches like twisted hands reaching out to grab me. At first, it was peaceful, just me, the trees, and the rustling leaves. But as I ventured deeper, an unsettling feeling crept over me. The air grew colder, and I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. About halfway through, I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound behind me. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing, just trees and shadows. Get a grip, I whispered to myself, but my voice sounded too loud in the stillness. I kept walking, picking up my pace. The path twisted and turned, and soon I realized I wasn't sure where I was anymore. Panic set in as I realized I could no longer see the trail markers. Just keep moving, I muttered. You'll find your way out. The shuffling sound returned, louder this time. It wasn't just behind me. It was all around me, circling. I spun in place, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Hello? I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. Is someone there? No answer. Just the shuffling, like feet dragging through the leaves. I started running. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs burned as I pushed forward. The path twisted again, and suddenly, I stumbled into a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a house, a decrepit, crumbling structure that looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The windows were broken, the door hanging off its hinges. But what caught my attention was the light, a dim, flickering glow from inside. Desperate for safety, I approached the house. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air smelled of damp wood and decay. Hello? I called again, my voice barely more than a whisper. No response. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The light was coming from a candle on a wooden table in the center of the room. Next to the candle was a journal, its cover worn and faded. I picked up the journal, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was messy, scrawled in a frantic hand. The entries told a chilling story of someone trapped in the woods, haunted by unseen forces. They're always watching. One entry read, "They don't let you leave." The last entry sent a shiver down my spine. If you're reading this, it's too late. They've already marked you. I dropped the journal, my hands trembling. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. It's just the wind, I told myself, though I didn't believe it. The shuffling sound returned, louder than ever. It was right outside the house. I ran to the window, peering out into the darkness. Shadows moved between the trees, figures darting in and out of view. No, I whispered. This can't be real. A loud thump echoed through the house as something heavy hit the door. I backed away, my heart racing. The door shuddered under the force of another impact. "Let me in," a voice whispered from the other side. It was soft, almost gentle, but there was something wrong with it, something inhuman. "Go away," I shouted, grabbing a chair and wedging it under the door handle. The voice laughed, a chilling, hollow sound. "You can't keep us out," it said. The candle flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on just as the window shattered. A hand reached through, clawing at the air. I screamed, backing into the corner. The figures outside surrounded the house, their faces obscured by shadows. They pressed against the broken window, their hands reaching for me. "We've been waiting for you," the voice said. "Join us." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "No, leave me alone." Suddenly, the front door burst open, and they poured in, twisted, shadowy figures with eyes like empty voids. They moved unnaturally, jerking and twitching as they closed in on me. Desperate, I grabbed the journal from the table and hurled it at them. To my surprise, they recoiled, hissing like animals. The words, I realized. They're afraid of the words. I picked up the journal, reading aloud from the pages. "In the name of light, I banish you." The figures screamed, their forms flickering like candle flames. I kept reading, the words flowing from my lips even as my voice shook. You have no power here. Return to the shadows from whence you came. One by one, they disappeared, dissolving into the darkness. The last figure lingered, its hollow eyes fixed on me. We'll be back, it whispered. You can't escape the woods. Then it, too, vanished. The house fell silent. I stood there, trembling, clutching the journal like a lifeline. When dawn broke, I stumbled out of the house and back onto the path. The woods were quiet, peaceful even, but I knew better. I ran all the way home, vowing never to take that shortcut again. I moved out of town the next day, but the nightmares still haunt me. Every night, I hear the whispers. They're always watching, always waiting. So, if you ever find yourself at the edge of those woods, remember my story. Don't go in. Stick to the main road. And whatever you do, don't listen to the whispers. This is the end of story 2. Story 3. I've always loved road trips. There's something about the open road, the freedom to explore places unseen, and the quiet solitude that calms my restless soul. This trip, however, was different. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway from my mundane routine, but it turned into a night I'll never forget. A night that still haunts me to this day. It all started when my best friend, Caleb, and I decided to take a spontaneous road trip through rural towns and forgotten highways. We wanted to explore places that weren't on any map, to find the hidden gems that most people overlooked. We packed up my old, trusty car and set out with no particular destination in mind. The first few days were uneventful, filled with scenic views, quirky roadside diners, and small-town charm. We drove through forests, crossed rivers, and stopped to take pictures at every peculiar landmark we came across. It was everything we had hoped for, until we found the road. It was late in the afternoon when we stumbled upon it. A narrow, gravel path branching off from the main highway, overgrown with weeds and barely visible. There was no sign to indicate where it led, but something about it piqued our curiosity. Caleb, always the adventurous one, grinned at me. "What do you think? Should we check it out?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment, but the lure of the unknown was too strong to resist. "Let's do it." We turned onto the forgotten road, the crunch of gravel under the tires the only sound breaking the eerie silence. The trees on either side grew denser, their twisted branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out the sun. As we drove deeper, the air grew colder, and an unsettling feeling settled in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a clearing. In the middle stood an old, decrepit house, its wooden walls warped and weathered by time. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt off. The windows were shattered, and the front door hung ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. "This place is creepy as hell," I muttered, but Caleb was already out of the car, his camera in hand. "Come on, we have to check it out," he called back. Reluctantly, I followed him. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and every step we took seemed to echo through the stillness. As we approached the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Inside, the house was a time capsule of forgotten memories. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. An old piano stood in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. Caleb, ever the curious explorer, wandered off to inspect the rooms, leaving me alone in the foyer. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, drifting through the air. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice, soft and melodic, calling my name. "Ethan." My heart skipped a beat. "Caleb," I called out, but there was no response. I followed the sound, my footsteps cautious on the creaking floorboards. The whisper led me to a narrow staircase at the back of the house, spiraling downward into darkness. I hesitated at the top, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but the voice was insistent. "Ethan, come down." Against my better judgment, I descended the stairs, the darkness swallowing me whole. The air grew colder with each step, and the scent of mold and decay grew stronger. At the bottom, I found myself in a basement, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with jars of preserved things. I couldn't tell what they were, but they looked organic, grotesque shapes floating in murky liquid. My stomach churned, and I turned away, only to come face to face with a large, wooden door. It was covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. The whispers grew louder, coming from beyond the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. "Ethan, what the hell are you doing?" Caleb's voice snapped me out of my trance. He stood at the top of the stairs, his face pale. "There's something down here," I said, my voice shaking. I heard it. It was calling my name. Caleb's eyes darted to the door, and for a moment, I saw fear in his gaze. "We need to leave. Now." I didn't argue. We hurried up the stairs and out of the house, the unsettling feeling growing stronger with each step. As we reached the car, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. "What was that place?" Caleb whispered, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. "I don't know, but I don't want to find out," I replied. We drove in silence, the forgotten road stretching endlessly before us. The trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes in the fading light. The air grew colder, and an oppressive darkness settled over us. Hours passed, and we realized we were still on the same road. No matter how far we drove, there was no end in sight. "This can't be right," Caleb muttered, glancing at the map. "We should have hit a main road by now." Panic set in as we realized we were trapped, lost in an endless loop. The road stretched on, unchanging, and the oppressive darkness seemed to grow thicker. Then, we saw it. The house. It stood in the clearing, just as we had left it, but something was different. The windows glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and shadows moved inside. My heart pounded as we realized we had circled back to the very place we had tried to escape. "We have to keep going," Caleb said, his voice trembling. We drove past the house, refusing to look back. But no matter how far we went, we always ended up back at the clearing. The house stood, waiting, its twisted silhouette looming in the darkness. Desperation took hold. We decided to approach the house once more, hoping to find answers or a way out. Inside, the house was different. The walls pulsed with a faint, rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat. The whispers were louder now, echoing through the halls. They called our names, beckoning us deeper into the house. We followed the sound to the basement, where the door stood ajar. The symbols carved into the wood glowed faintly, pulsing with the same rhythm as the house. Beyond the door, darkness awaited. "We have to go in," Caleb said, his voice hollow. "Are you crazy?" I snapped. "We need to find a way out, not go deeper." But it was too late. The door creaked open, revealing a vast, cavernous space. The walls were lined with more jars, each one containing twisted, grotesque figures that seemed to writhe in the murky liquid. At the center of the room stood an altar, covered in symbols and surrounded by candles. A figure stood at the altar, cloaked in shadow. It turned slowly, revealing a face that sent chills down my spine. It was me. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice a distorted echo of my own. "We've been waiting for you." Panic set in, and we turned to flee, but the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. The whispers grew deafening, drowning out our screams. The last thing I remember is the figure's smile, twisted and unnatural, as darkness consumed us. This is the end of Story 3. Story 4. When I was 13, my parents sent me to a summer camp deep in the forests of Vermont. The camp was called Silver Pines, and it had been around for decades, though few people I knew had ever heard of it. My parents insisted it was a great place to meet new friends and explore the outdoors, but from the moment we drove up the winding gravel path, I felt an unsettling chill run down my spine. Silver Pines was old, far older than the camps I had seen in brochures. The cabins were weather-worn, their wood darkened with age, and the main lodge had a sagging roof that looked like it could collapse at any moment. The trees surrounding the camp were ancient, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Even in broad daylight, the woods seemed to hum with a quiet, watchful presence. I wasn't the only camper to notice. As we gathered around the campfire on the first night, a few of the older kids whispered about the camp's dark history. "Did you hear about the missing counselor?" one boy said, his voice low. Back in the 80s, a girl named Emily went into the woods and never came back. They searched for weeks, but they never found her. They say she's still out there. Another girl added, her eyes wide. People hear her calling for help at night. Our counselor, a tall, wiry man named Steve, overheard and quickly dismissed the stories as nonsense. But as the night wore on and the fire died down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with this place. The first few days passed without incident. We went hiking, swam in the lake, and learned basic survival skills. But on the fourth night, everything changed. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange sound outside our cabin, a soft, melodic humming. It wasn't any of the counselors. I was sure of that. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, but there was something off about it, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake my cabin mates, and crept to the window. The moonlight illuminated the forest beyond the camp, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. A girl, dressed in white, with long dark hair that hung over her face. I blinked, and she was gone. The next morning, I told Steve about what I had seen, but he brushed it off as a dream. This place has a way of playing tricks on your mind, he said. It's just the wind and shadows, but I knew what I had seen, and I wasn't the only one. Later that day, during free time, I overheard two boys talking near the edge of the woods. I heard it last night. One of them said, "The singing. It sounded like it was coming from the lake. Do you think it's her?" The other boy asked. "Emily?" That night, I decided to find out for myself. After lights out, I waited until the cabin was silent before slipping on my shoes and sneaking outside. The air was crisp, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the camp. I made my way toward the lake, my heart pounding with each step. As I neared the water's edge, the humming began again. It was faint at first, but it grew louder as I approached the dock. The melody was the same, haunting, sorrowful, and strangely hypnotic. I stepped onto the dock, the wood creaking beneath my feet. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the moonlight like a sheet of glass. And there, standing at the end of the dock, was the girl. She turned slowly to face me, her hair parting to reveal hollow, black eyes. Her lips moved, but the sound that came out was not human. It was a guttural, otherworldly wail that echoed across the lake. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The girl took a step toward me, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden planks. "Help me," she whispered, her voice distorted and unnatural. "Please, help me." I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the dock as I fled back to the cabin. I didn't stop until I was safely inside, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The next morning, I was determined to leave. I packed my things and went as Steve, demanding that he call my parents. "I can't stay here," I told him. "There's something wrong with this place." Steve sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, kid, I've been working here for 10 years. I've heard all the stories, seen kids freak out over shadows and strange noises. But nothing has ever happened. I saw her," I insisted. "The girl. She's real." Steve's expression darkened. "You need to stay away from the lake. Do you understand me? Don't go near it." His warning only made me more determined to find out the truth. That afternoon, I gathered a small group of campers who had also heard the singing. We decided to explore the woods together, hoping to uncover the camp's secrets. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches intertwining to block out the sun. The air grew colder, and an oppressive silence settled over us. We found an old, overgrown path that led to a crumbling stone structure, an abandoned chapel. The doors were ajar, and inside, we discovered rows of decaying pews and a shattered stained glass window. At the front of the chapel, a rusted iron cross hung on the wall, its surface marred with strange symbols. "This must be where they held services," one of the boys whispered. "Look," I said, pointing to the floor. In the dust, we could see footprints leading toward a trapdoor near the altar. We hesitated for a moment before lifting the heavy door. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, the air below damp and musty. "Are we really doing this?" one of the girls asked, her voice trembling. "We have to know," I said, my curiosity outweighing my fear. We descended the stairs, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. At the bottom, we found a small underground chamber. The walls were covered in more of the strange symbols, and in the center of the room stood a stone pedestal. On it rested a glass jar, inside which floated a lock of dark hair. Suddenly, the humming began again, louder than ever. The air grew cold, and the symbols on the walls seemed to glow with an unearthly light. "We need to leave," one of the boys said, his voice shaking. But before we could move, the trapdoor slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. The humming grew deafening, and the jar on the pedestal shattered, the hair inside writhing like a living thing. "Help me," the voice echoed through the chamber. "Free me." We huddled together, our flashlights flickering. The air grew colder, and the shadows around us seemed to take on monstrous shapes. Suddenly, the trapdoor creaked open, and Steve stood at the top of the stairs, his face pale. "What have you done?" he whispered, his voice filled with dread. We scrambled up the stairs, desperate to escape. As we reached the surface, the chapel began to collapse, the ground trembling beneath our feet. We ran back to camp, never looking back. The humming faded, replaced by the distant sound of laughter, the laughter of children lost to time. My parents picked me up the next day, and I never spoke of what happened at Silver Pines again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that haunting melody in my dreams, and I see her face, watching me from the shadows. Some places are meant to be forgotten. Silver Pines is one of them. This is the end of Story 4. Story 5. I've always believed that every town has its secrets. Hidden beneath layers of folklore and urban legends are truths no one dares to confront. In our small town, that secret was Blackwood Forest. It stretched endlessly on the outskirts, a dark expanse of towering trees that seemed to swallow light. No one ventured too far in. Everyone knew the tales. Stories of people who entered and never returned. Whispers of ghostly figures and strange voices. As a child, I dismissed them as stories to scare kids from wandering off. But now, I know better. It began on a chilly autumn evening. My friend Emma and I decided to camp near the edge of Blackwood. She was always the adventurous type, constantly seeking a thrill. I, on the other hand, was more cautious. But that night, her excitement was contagious. "Come on, Jake," she said, flashing me a mischievous grin. "We're not going in, just near the edge. What's the worst that can happen?" Reluctantly, I agreed. We packed our gear and set off, the setting sun casting long shadows across the forest floor. As we approached the edge, a strange unease settled over me. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes. We set up our tent just outside the tree line. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As darkness fell, the forest seemed to come alive with whispers. I brushed it off as the wind rustling through the trees. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide. "It's just the wind," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Around midnight, we sat by the campfire, talking and laughing. It was then that we heard it, a soft, melodic humming. It drifted through the trees, eerie and hypnotic. Emma stood, her expression a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Who could be out here at this hour?" she wondered aloud. "Probably a hiker," I suggested, though the unease in my chest grew. The humming grew louder, weaving through the trees like a ghostly lullaby. Emma took a step toward the forest. "Emma, no," I said, grabbing her arm. "We shouldn't go in there." But she shook me off, her eyes glazed. "It's beautiful," she murmured, as if in a trance. I watched in horror as she crossed the threshold into Blackwood. Panic surged through me, and I followed. The moment I stepped into the forest, the air changed. It was colder, heavier. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. "Emma," I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The humming continued, now interspersed with soft whispers. They sounded like distant voices, too faint to make out. I ran deeper into the forest, my flashlight casting feeble beams of light that barely penetrated the gloom. Emma. Then I saw her. She stood in a small clearing, her back to me. Her arms hung limply by her sides, and her head was tilted at an unnatural angle. The humming stopped. Emma. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. She turned slowly, and my blood ran cold. Her eyes were wide and unseeing. Her lips curved into a vacant smile. "They're coming," she whispered. Before I could react, she collapsed to the ground. I rushed to her side, shaking her. "Emma, wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, and she gasped for air. "Jake," she whispered, trembling. "We need to leave. Now." I helped her to her feet, and we stumbled through the forest, desperate to find our way out. But the trees seemed to shift and twist, blocking our path. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Don't look back," Emma warned, her voice shaking. "No matter what you hear, don't look back." We ran blindly, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. The whispers followed, now accompanied by the soft sound of footsteps. I fought the urge to turn, to see what was behind us. Suddenly, the forest opened up, and we stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, covered in strange symbols. Emma froze, her eyes wide with terror. "This wasn't here before," she whispered. Before I could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "Welcome," it rasped, its voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. We backed away, but the figure advanced slowly. "You've heard our song," it said. "Now you belong to the forest." Emma grabbed my hand, and we ran. The figure's laughter echoed through the trees, chilling me to the bone. We didn't stop until we burst through the tree line, collapsing onto the ground. For a moment, there was silence. The whispers had stopped, and the air felt lighter. But as I helped Emma to her feet, I noticed something. The forest had changed. The trees were taller, their branches denser. It was as if Blackwood had grown while we were inside. "We need to tell someone," I said, my voice trembling. Emma shook her head. "No one will believe us. They'll think we're crazy." Reluctantly, I agreed. We returned to town, our experience weighing heavily on us. Days turned into weeks, but the memory of that night never faded. And then the whispers began again. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Soft, melodic humming drifting through my window at night. But soon, it grew louder, more persistent. Emma heard it too. "It's calling us back," she said, fear in her eyes. "It won't stop until we return." We tried to resist, but the pull of the forest was too strong. One night, we found ourselves standing at the edge of Blackwood once more. "We need to end this," Emma whispered. Together, we ventured into the forest, determined to confront whatever dark force lurked within. The trees closed in around us, and the whispers welcomed us back. In the clearing, the stone altar awaited. The figure stood beside it, its eyes glowing with malevolent delight. "You've returned," it said, "and now you'll never leave." It raised its hands, and the forest came alive with movement. Shadows emerged from the trees, figures with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. They circled us, their whispers growing into a deafening chant. Desperation surged within me. I grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the altar. The stone shattered, and the figures shrieked in agony. "No!" The figure roared, its form beginning to dissolve. The shadows retreated, and the forest grew still. Emma and I stood in silence, our hearts pounding. "Is it over?" I asked. Emma nodded slowly. "I think so." As we made our way out of Blackwood, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. The forest felt different, lighter, but as we reached the edge, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't truly free. And then I heard it, a soft, melodic humming drifting through the trees. The forest song, calling us back. This is the end of Story 5. Story 6. The Mansion on Raven Hill, a name whispered with caution and dread by the townsfolk of Blackwater. Perched on a hilltop, its shadow stretched over the town like a sinister omen. For years, No one had dared to venture close, not after the last family that lived there vanished without a trace. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, and it was that same perilous curiosity that led me to Raven Hill. I arrived in Blackwater on a chilly October evening. The air carried the scent of rain, and leaves danced on the cobblestone streets as I parked my car outside the only inn in town. Inside, the innkeeper, a wiry old man named Harold, gave me a skeptical look as I checked in. "You're not here for Raven Hill, are you?" he asked, his voice gruff. I smiled, trying to brush off his concern. "I'm just passing through." His gaze lingered a moment longer before he handed me the key. "Stay away from that place," he warned. "No good has ever come from it." I nodded, but my mind was already made up. I had come to Blackwater for a reason. As a writer, I was always on the hunt for stories, and the legend of the cursed mansion intrigued me. The disappearances, the strange lights seen at night, the whispers of ghosts. It was the perfect setting for a chilling tale. The next morning, armed with my notebook and camera, I set off for Raven Hill. The mansion loomed ahead, its once grand exterior now weathered and broken. Ivy clung to the walls, and the windows were dark and empty, like hollow eyes watching my approach. I pushed open the rusted gate, its creak breaking the eerie silence. The path leading to the front door was overgrown with weeds, and the air felt colder as I drew closer. As I reached the porch, I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The grand foyer, with its cracked marble floor and faded wallpaper, spoke of a time when the mansion had been beautiful. Now, it was a shell of its former self. As I explored, the house seemed to breathe with me. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and the wind whispered through the broken windows. I found myself drawn to the grand staircase, its wooden banister smooth from years of use. I ascended slowly, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each step. At the top of the stairs, I turned down a hallway lined with doors. Most were locked or led to empty rooms, but one door stood ajar at the end of the hall. As I pushed it open, I was met with a chilling sight. The room was a nursery. A crib stood in the corner, draped with a tattered lace curtain. Toys lay scattered across the floor, covered in dust. On the walls, faded paintings of animals and flowers stared back at me, their cheerful colors dulled by time. A sense of unease washed over me as I approached the crib. Inside, a doll lay abandoned, its porcelain face cracked and one eye missing. As I reached down to pick it up, a sudden chill ran down my spine. "Leave." The whisper was faint, but unmistakable. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty house. Silence. Taking a deep breath, I tried to shake off the fear. It was an old house. Creaks and whispers were to be expected. But as I left the nursery and continued my exploration, the feeling of being watched never left me. In one of the bedrooms, I found an old journal tucked away in a drawer. The cover was worn, and the pages yellowed with age. Flipping through it, I realized it belonged to a woman named Eleanor Ravenscroft, the last known occupant of the mansion. Her entries started off mundane. Notes about the weather, the town, her husband's business dealings. But as I read further, her words grew more frantic. October 13th, 1892, Henry has been acting strange. He talks of shadows moving in the corners of his vision, of voices calling his name. I fear the house is affecting him. October 20th, 1892, the whispers are louder now. I hear them too. They speak of the curse, of the family before us. I tried to tell Henry we must leave, but he won't listen. He says we are safe here. But I know better. October 31st, 1892, they took him. The shadows came for Henry in the night. I am alone now. I fear they will come for me next. The final entry sent shivers down my spine. "What happened to you, Eleanor?" I whispered, closing the journal. As dusk fell, I found myself back in the nursery. Something about that room unsettled me, but I couldn't stay away. The doll still lay in the crib, its cracked face staring up at me. "Why did you stay?" I murmured, brushing the dust from the crib. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the temperature plummeted. My breath formed clouds in the air, and a sense of dread filled the room. Leave. The whisper was louder this time, and I could feel the presence behind me. I turned slowly, my heart racing. In the corner of the room, a shadowy figure stood, barely visible in the dim light. Its form was human-like, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice a low growl. "I'm just looking for answers," I pleaded. "I want to know what happened here." The figure stopped, tilting its head as if considering my words. Then, it spoke again. "The house is cursed. The Ravenscrofts paid the price. Now, it wants more." "More what?" I asked, but the figure vanished before I could get an answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the grand hall, the journal open in my lap. The words of Eleanor Ravenscroft echoed in my mind. The house was cursed. But why? And how could I break it? As midnight approached, the whispers returned. They seemed to come from the walls, the floors, the very air around me. "Join us," the voices called out, growing louder and more insistent. Shadows danced across the walls, forming shapes and figures that seemed to reach for me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I won't become part of this." But the house had other plans. At the stroke of midnight, the front door slammed shut and the windows shattered. The house groaned, as if awakening from a long slumber. The shadows grew darker, enveloping the room. "It's time," the voices whispered. I ran, my heart pounding, but the house twisted and turned, the hallways stretching endlessly. Doors slammed shut as I passed, and the shadows followed, their whispers growing louder. "You can't escape," they taunted. I stumbled into the nursery, the one place I had been avoiding. The doll in the crib was gone, replaced by a figure, Eleanor Ravenscroft. Her hollow eyes met mine, and she reached out a hand. "Help us," she pleaded. "How?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. "Destroy the heart of the house," she whispered. "The mirror in the grand hall. It holds the curse." Gathering my courage, I raced back to the grand hall. The mirror stood tall, its surface shimmering with an unnatural light. Grabbing a nearby chair, I hurled it at the glass. The mirror shattered, and the house screamed. The shadows recoiled, and the whispers faded. As dawn broke, the mansion on Ravenhill crumbled, its cursed walls falling into ruin. I stood amidst the rubble, my heart heavy but my spirit free. Eleanor Ravenscroft's spirit appeared one last time, a soft smile on her face. "Thank you," she whispered before fading into the light. I left Blackwater that morning, the weight of the mansion's curse lifted, but as I drove away, a shard of the mirror glinted in the back seat, its surface reflecting a twisted smile. The curse wasn't gone. It had just found a new home. This is the end of Story 6. Story 7. When I was a kid, my family owned a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine. It was a place of solitude, disconnected from the world. No cell service, no internet, just miles of dense forest surrounding us. My parents loved the quiet, the escape from city life, but I hated it. There was something about the woods that unsettled me. I never felt alone, even when I should have been. The first time I heard the whispers, I thought it was the wind. I was 10 years old, playing by myself near the tree line while my parents worked on repairs around the cabin. The breeze picked up, rustling the leaves overhead. Then I heard it, soft, indistinct murmurs, like distant voices carried by the wind. I froze, straining to listen. "Come closer." The voice was faint, almost playful. I glanced back at the cabin, but my parents were out of sight. My heart thumped in my chest as I took a few hesitant steps toward the trees. "Hello?" I called out. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, just as I was about to turn back, a low chuckle echoed from the shadows of the woods. I bolted back to the cabin, heart racing, and didn't mention it to my parents. Who would believe me? Years passed, and I eventually convinced myself that I had imagined it. But every summer, when we returned to the cabin, I avoided the woods. The unease never left me, lingering like a shadow just out of sight. It wasn't until I was 17 that I ventured into the woods again. My parents had gone into town for supplies, leaving me alone for the afternoon, bored and restless. I decided to explore the forest, armed with nothing but a flashlight and my curiosity. The woods were eerily quiet. The towering trees seemed to swallow sound, their dense canopy blocking out the sun. As I walked, the air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over me. I told myself it was just nerves, that there was nothing to fear. Then I heard it again. The whispers. "Come closer." I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice was clearer now, unmistakable. It sounded like a woman's voice, soft and melodic. But there was something wrong about it, something unnatural. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I turned to leave, but the whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding me from all sides. "Stay with us," the voices urged. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling to the ground. As I scrambled to my feet, I caught a glimpse of something through the trees, a figure, pale and indistinct, watching me. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. My chest heaved, my mind racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something was out there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. The whispers haunted me, echoing in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the woods, its pale face staring back at me. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate. My blood ran cold. I sat up, heart pounding, and crept to the window. The moonlight illuminated the clearing outside, but I saw nothing. The footsteps continued, circling the cabin. Then came the knock. 3 soft taps on the front door. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. The knock came again, louder this time. "Go away," I shouted, my voice trembling. Silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for the knock to return, but the night remained quiet. Eventually, I crawled back into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child. Sleep didn't come. The next morning, I found footprints outside the cabin. They weren't human. The tracks were elongated, with claw-like toes that dug deep into the earth. I followed them to the edge of the woods, where they disappeared. "It's just an animal," I told myself. Nothing to worry about, but the unease gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the next few days, the whispers grew more frequent. They came at all hours, rising and falling like a twisted lullaby. My parents didn't hear them. "You're just stressed," my mom said when I finally confessed. "It's all in your head," but I knew better. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on the porch, staring into the woods. The whispers called to me, soft and insistent. "Come closer. Stay with us." I stood, my body moving of its own accord. Before I knew it, I was walking toward the tree line, drawn by the voices. The world around me seemed to blur, the trees twisting and warping like a living thing. Then I saw her. The figure from before stood in a clearing, her pale skin glowing in the fading light. She was beautiful, in an otherworldly way, with long, flowing hair and eyes that glowed like embers. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She smiled, a slow, chilling grin. "We've been waiting for you." Her voice was the same as the whispers, soft and melodic, but laced with something dark. "Why?" I asked, taking a step back. Her eyes narrowed. "You belong to us now." Fear gripped me, but I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, rooted to the spot. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, shapes twisting and writhing in the dark. "Run," a voice inside me urged. "Run now." With a surge of willpower, I broke free from the spell and bolted back toward the cabin. The whispers chased me, growing more frantic. "Come back," they screamed. But I didn't stop. I reached the cabin, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My parents stared at me in shock. "What happened?" my dad demanded. "There's something in the woods," I gasped. "Something's after me." My mom placed a hand on my shoulder, her expression softening. "It's okay. "You're safe now." But I wasn't. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They surrounded the cabin, a chorus of voices calling my name. I huddled under the covers, tears streaming down my face. Then came the knock. 3 soft taps on the window. I didn't dare move. The knock came again, more insistent. "Let us in," the voices pleaded. "We'll take care of you." I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop. But the knocking continued, relentless. "Come closer." The next morning, my parents decided it was time to leave. "This place isn't good for you," my dad said. "We'll sell the cabin." Relief washed over me. We packed our things and loaded the car, leaving the cursed place behind. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. She was standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. Her eyes locked onto mine, her smile widening. The whispers followed me home. It's been years since that summer, but I can still hear them. Late at night, when the world is quiet, the whispers return. They call my name, soft and insistent. "Come closer. Stay with us." I don't know how much longer I can resist. The pull grows stronger every day. I fear that one day, I won't be able to say no. And when that day comes, I know I'll see her again, waiting for me in the hollow woods. This is the end of Story 7. Story 8. There's a forest in my town that no one dares enter after sunset. Everyone knows the stories. They say it's haunted by something ancient, something older than the town itself. My grandfather used to call it the sleeper of the pines. He warned us never to venture too deep. He would tell tales of how the forest had claimed lives, how shadows moved when no wind blew, and how those who wandered too far often lost their way, never to return. As a kid, I thought it was just folklore to keep children from getting lost. But after what happened to me, I'll never dismiss those warnings again. Some things are meant to be left undisturbed, and some stories should never be told. The forest wasn't just a part of our town's geography. It was woven into our history, our fears, and our identity. Every family had a story, an uncle who disappeared, a cousin who heard whispers in the wind. It became a rite of passage to dare one another to go to the forest's edge, but never further. Despite these tales, there was always a lingering curiosity in our minds. We couldn't resist the call of the unknown, and on one fateful autumn evening, that curiosity led us into the heart of darkness. It started one autumn evening. My friends and I were sitting around a bonfire, swapping ghost stories. The air was crisp, the scent of burning wood mingling with the earthy aroma of fallen leaves. Shadows danced around us as the fire crackled, casting fleeting shapes on the trees. Somehow, the conversation turned to the forest. Everyone had a different tale about someone who had vanished or gone mad after wandering too far in. "It's just old stories to scare kids," Jake said, tossing another log onto the fire. He leaned back, grinning smugly. "I've been in those woods 100 times. Nothing's ever happened to me." Olivia, always the skeptic, but also the most knowledgeable about local legends, shook her head. "That's because you don't go far enough," she countered, her voice firm. "The stories say the sleeper doesn't bother you if you stay near the edge. It's the heart of the forest you need to avoid." Her words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken warning. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The crackle of the fire seemed distant, drowned out by the growing tension. But Jake just laughed. "Then let's prove it," he said with a challenging smirk. "We'll go to the heart of the forest and stay until midnight. If we make it out, no more ghost stories." Despite my unease, I found myself agreeing. Peer pressure can be a powerful thing, especially when you're a teenager desperate to fit in. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement. So, armed with flashlights and a bottle of whiskey to bolster our courage, we ventured into the forest. The trees loomed overhead, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky like grasping fingers. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was as if the forest itself was aware of our presence, waiting for us to cross an unseen threshold. With every step, the forest grew darker and more oppressive. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy, leaving us to rely on the faint glow of our flashlights. The trees grew denser, their trunks twisted and gnarled like ancient guardians of secrets long forgotten. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. Olivia's grip on her flashlight tightened. "Are we there yet?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake checked his watch, though his bravado was fading. "Almost," he replied, but I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting time and space, making every step feel like we were sinking deeper into a nightmare. Finally, we reached a clearing. It wasn't a natural break in the trees. It felt intentional, as if the forest itself had bent to reveal this place. In the center stood a massive stone altar, covered in moss and carved with symbols that hurt my eyes to look at. The markings seemed to shift and writhe like living things. "What the hell is this?" Jake muttered, stepping closer. He reached out, brushing away the moss to reveal more of the carvings. Olivia and I hung back, uneasy. There was something wrong about this place, something deeply unnatural. The air felt heavy, charged with a strange energy, like the ground itself was pulsing with a heartbeat we couldn't hear. Then we heard it. A low, rhythmic chanting rose from the shadows, so faint at first that I thought it was the wind playing tricks on my mind. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, more insidious. Voices, speaking in a language I didn't recognize, filled the clearing. The sound wasn't human. It was guttural, ancient, and haunting. Jake spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The chanting stopped abruptly, leaving behind a suffocating silence that pressed against our eardrums like a tangible force. The silence stretched on, thick and impenetrable. For a moment, I dared to hope that it was over. But then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was tall and emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its skin was pale as moonlight, stretched taut over bones that jutted out like knives. But it was the eyes that held me captive, glowing with an otherworldly light, filled with malice and hunger. Its mouth twisted into a cruel smile as it stepped closer. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered, its voice like rusted metal scraping against stone. The creature's presence felt ancient, like it belonged to a world long forgotten, a time before humans walked the earth. Panic set in. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Olivia's hand. We bolted for the trees, Jake close behind. The forest seemed to come alive around us, branches reaching out like grasping hands. The ground shifted beneath our feet, roots twisting and writhing like serpents. The whispers followed us, growing louder, more insistent. "You can't escape," they hissed, weaving their way into my mind. "You woke the sleeper." The words echoed in my head, twisting into my thoughts until I couldn't tell if they were real or imagined. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. I don't know how we made it out. One moment, we were running through the cursed forest. The next, we were collapsing on the side of the road, gasping for breath. But Jake was gone. We called his name, our voices echoing through the night. There was no response. The shadows seemed to swallow our words, taking them deep into the forest where Jake had vanished. The cold night air bit at my skin, but all I could feel was the overwhelming dread that we had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. We went to the police, but they found no trace of him. The official story was that he got lost, but I knew better. The sleeper had taken him. The town whispered about the tragedy, but they moved on. Days turned into weeks, and the world continued its relentless march forward. But Olivia and I couldn't forget. The whispers lingered, faint but persistent, haunting our dreams and making us jump at every rustle of leaves. The forest was always there, lurking at the edge of our vision, waiting for us to return. Months after Jake's disappearance, Olivia and I decided to visit his family to offer our condolences. His mother, hollow-eyed and grief-stricken, barely acknowledged us, but his younger sister, Ellie, cornered me as we were leaving. "He's not gone," she whispered, clutching my arm with a desperate intensity. "I hear him at night. He calls to me from the forest. He says he wants to come home." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Olivia and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we both knew there was nothing we could do to help. The forest had claimed Jake, and it wasn't finished. Years passed, but the fear never faded. I moved away, trying to escape the curse. I built a new life, pretending the forest was just a bad memory. But last night, I heard the whispers again. They were clearer this time, more insistent. "Come back," they urged. "It's not over." And when I looked out my window, I saw Jake standing at the edge of the woods, his eyes glowing with that same unnatural light. He looked the same as the night he disappeared, untouched by time. But there was something deeply off about him. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. I tried to ignore him, to tell myself it was just a dream. But when I woke up this morning, there were muddy footprints leading from my window to the forest. The whispers are louder now, echoing in my mind, calling me home. The forest never forgets, and neither does the sleeper. It's waiting for me, for us, to finish what we started. The air feels heavier with each passing hour, as if the forest's pull is tightening its grip. I know I shouldn't go back. Every instinct is screaming at me to stay away. This is the end of Story 8. Story 9. There's a lake on the outskirts of my hometown that locals avoid like the plague. It's not marked on any maps, and no one talks about it openly. They just call it the Silent Mirror because, no matter the season, its surface remains eerily still and reflective, like glass. My grandmother told me stories about the lake when I was little. She said it was cursed, a place where lost souls gathered, unable to move on. But she always finished with a warning. Never, under any circumstances, touch the water. As kids, we were naturally curious. Forbidden places have a strange allure. But even the most daring of us never went near the lake. There was something oppressive about it, an invisible boundary that made your skin crawl the closer you got. Still, the stories became a rite of passage, a dare whispered at sleepovers, a test of bravery. I was 15 when my friends challenged me to spend a night by the lake. "It's just a story," my best friend Eric said, grinning. "Nothing will happen." I wish I had listened to my instincts. We arrived at dusk, backpacks stuffed with snacks, flashlights, and a couple of beers we'd stolen from Eric's older brother. The forest around the lake was dense, the trees towering above us like ancient sentinels. As we made our way to the shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. When we finally reached the lake, its surface gleamed under the fading light, a perfect mirror reflecting the crimson sky. It was beautiful, but unsettling. We set up camp a few feet from the water, building a small fire to keep the dark at bay. As the night deepened, the mood lightened. We laughed, told stories, and dared each other to go closer to the lake. Eric, always the fearless one, grabbed a stick and threw it into the water. "See? Nothing happens," he said, smirking, but as the ripples spread across the surface, a chill ran down my spine. The water stilled again too quickly, as if something beneath had smoothed it over. Hours passed, and one by one, my friends dozed off. I sat by the fire, staring at the lake. Something about it felt wrong. The longer I looked, the more it seemed to pull at me, like it wanted me to come closer. The shadows cast by the fire danced across its surface, creating strange shapes that seemed almost human. Then I saw it, a face, pale and sorrowful, staring back at me from beneath the water. I blinked, but it was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. I woke to the sound of water lapping against the shore. The fire had died down to embers, and my friends were still asleep. But the lake wasn't still anymore. The water churned softly, as if disturbed by an unseen hand. I stood up, heart pounding, and took a step closer. That's when I saw her, a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, standing waist-deep in the water. Her hair floated around her like seaweed, and her eyes locked onto mine with a haunting intensity. "Help me," she whispered. Her voice carried on the breeze. I froze. Everything in me screamed to run, but I couldn't move. She took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "I just want to go home." Her voice was filled with sorrow and longing, but there was something else beneath it, a darkness, a hunger. I took a step back, shaking my head. "You shouldn't be here," I managed to say. Her expression twisted into something cruel, and her eyes darkened. "Neither should you," she hissed. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted, and I fell to my knees. The air grew colder, and the whispers began. Soft, insistent voices that seemed to come from the lake itself. "Join us," they murmured. "We've been waiting." I scrambled back, my hands digging into the dirt. The woman took another step toward me, her smile widening. "Once you touch the water, you belong to the lake," she said. "It never lets go." Panic set in. I turned to wake my friends, but they were gone. Their sleeping bags lay empty, their belongings scattered. "Eric? Jenna?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water and the whispers growing louder. "They're with me now," the woman said, her voice echoing in my mind. "And soon you will be too." I stumbled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and turning, making every path look the same. I don't know how I made it out. One moment, I was running through the cursed forest. The next, I was collapsing on the side of the road, gasping for breath. But Eric and Jenna were never found. The official story was that they drowned, but I knew better. The lake had taken them. I moved away, trying to escape the memories, but they followed me. I still hear the whispers at night, soft and insistent. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the woman's face, pale and sorrowful, calling me back to the silent mirror. Last night, I woke to find muddy footprints leading from my window to my bed. The whispers are louder now, calling me home. The lake never forgets, and it never lets go. It's waiting for me to return, to finish what it started. If you're reading this, heed my warning. Stay away from the lake. Some waters are meant to stay undisturbed. Some stories are better left untold. This is the end of Story 9. Story 10. I never believed in ghosts. I grew up in a practical, grounded household. My mother, a strong woman with little patience for the supernatural, often mocked anyone who dared mention ghosts or hauntings. Her explanation for every odd sound or strange occurrence was simple. "It's just your imagination." But everything changed the day I moved into my new apartment. It wasn't that I didn't believe in the possibility of spirits or dark forces. I simply thought that ghosts were something you only read about in books or saw in movies. In real life, there was always a logical explanation for things. That was the mentality that guided me when I signed the lease for a 2-bedroom apartment in a crumbling building in the city. It wasn't luxurious, but it was affordable and in a great location, just a short walk from work. Perfect for a single guy like me, trying to get his life together. The building was old, really old, and had a musty, antique smell to it. The kind of smell you only find in places with history. But I was fine with that. I didn't mind the creaky floors or the faded paint on the walls. I even liked it. There was something charming about living in a place that had seen so much. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that this building had secrets, and I was about to uncover them the hard way. The first few nights were uneventful. The apartment was quiet, save for the occasional creaks of the old wooden floors. The faint sounds of traffic from outside drifted in through the single-pane windows. But there was something about the air that felt thick, almost like it was waiting for something, or someone. At night, I sometimes felt a chill that wasn't quite right. It wasn't cold enough to warrant a jacket, but it was unsettling, like the temperature itself was trying to warn me. I brushed it off as just the building's age, or maybe my overactive imagination. But then things started happening. It began innocently enough. I started hearing faint whispers, almost inaudible at first. It was when I was trying to fall asleep, right on the edge of drifting off. The whispers would float through the darkness, just beyond my comprehension. At first, I assumed it was just the wind blowing through the cracks in the old windows. The building settled a lot, especially at night. I told myself it was nothing, but it felt like the whispers were getting closer, almost as if they were inside the walls, just out of reach. One evening, I came home from work to an apartment that felt unusually dark. I flicked on the lights, but they didn't illuminate the room as they should. The bulbs were dim, casting strange shadows across the walls. I thought nothing of it, Perhaps the bulbs were going out, but as I walked into the kitchen to make dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was thick with a strange tension, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I shrugged it off and went about my evening, but the sensation of being watched lingered. I couldn't put my finger on it, but every time I glanced around the room, I felt like there was someone, or something, just out of view, lurking in the darkness. The feeling grew more intense the longer I stayed in the apartment. A few nights later, after another long day at work, I tried to relax by reading a book in bed. I was exhausted, but my mind was racing, and I needed to do something to unwind. The apartment was completely silent, save for the sound of my turning pages. Then, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, the whispers started again. This time, they were louder, almost clear, like voices from just outside the room. The words were unintelligible, but they seemed urgent, like they were trying to communicate something to me. I sat up in bed, heart racing, trying to locate the source of the sounds. But there was nothing, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. No wind, no rattling windows, just silence. I thought it was just my imagination, and I tried to push it from my mind. But then something worse happened. The whispers escalated to a growl, low and guttural. It wasn't like any animal sound I had ever heard. It was as if something, or someone, was getting closer. Slowly, I turned my head toward the hallway. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, in the dim light, I saw a shape, tall, thin, and gaunt. It stood motionless, just beyond the reach of the light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I realized it wasn't. The figure was real. It was there, watching me, its long limbs stretched unnaturally. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers grew louder, and I could hear words now, though they were garbled and unintelligible. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, its dark form blending into the shadows. But then, slowly, it started to glide toward me, its movements smooth but unsettlingly fluid. I couldn't look away. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed by fear. The closer it got, the more I could make out its features, if they could even be called features. Its face was a blur, a shifting void that seemed to distort the air around it. The whispering voices grew louder, clearer, and now they were joined by something else, a hiss, like air being sucked through a tight opening. It was then that I realized the figure was not just standing there. It was moving, silently, toward me. Suddenly, the thing stopped, its long, bony fingers hovering just inches from my face. The whispers ceased, and in the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. For a brief moment, I thought I might be able to speak, to yell, but no sound came from my mouth. The figure's form flickered, like static on a broken television, and then it retreated, gliding back into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I stumbled backward into my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I felt dizzy and disoriented, as if the very air in the apartment had changed. The whispers had stopped, but I could still feel the presence of the thing in the hallway, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that night, and the next day, I immediately called the landlord, asking to be moved to another unit, but the landlord just laughed it off, dismissing my concerns with a casual wave of his hand. "This building is safe," he said. "Nothing has ever happened here. You're just adjusting to the change. You'll get used to it," but I wasn't convinced. I knew what I had seen. I could still feel the cold, clammy presence of whatever that thing was. Against my better judgment, I decided to stay. I couldn't afford to move, and I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting. But things only grew worse after that. The whispers became more frequent, and the shadow, the gaunt figure, appeared more and more often. It wasn't just in the hallway anymore. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like something was standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me. Other times, I would catch glimpses of the figure moving just outside the corner of my eye. Then came the glass. One evening, while I was preparing dinner, I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat, and I rushed to see what had happened. A glass had fallen from the counter and shattered across the floor. But as I bent down to clean up the mess, something caught my eye. The shards of glass had been arranged in a strange pattern, a symbol. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, but there was something undeniably eerie about it. It felt deliberate, like it was meant for me to find. I had to leave. There was no other choice. That night, I packed my things in a hurry. I couldn't stay another minute in that apartment. The whispers were now constant, and the shadow was always just outside my vision, lurking. The growls, the whispers, the presence. It was all too much. I left the keys on the kitchen counter and ran out into the night, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care where I went, just as long as it was far from that building. As I walked down the street, I could have sworn I heard that familiar whisper again, calling my name, but I didn't look back. Now, months later, I live in a new apartment, far from that cursed place. But even now, when the night is quiet and I'm alone, I can still hear the whispers sometimes. They're faint, just on the edge of hearing. And sometimes, I feel the cold breath of something watching me, just out of sight. The shadow still lingers, in my dreams and in the silence between heartbeats. Some nights, I hear the voice, clear and sharp. You should never have come here. This is the end of Story 10. Story 11. I had always been the skeptical type. Ghosts, spirits, haunted houses, they were things I read about in novels or saw in horror movies. I never thought they were real. But my perception changed after I moved into the old Victorian house on Elm Street. It was a beautiful house, though in desperate need of repairs. The garden was overgrown, and the windows were dusty with years of neglect. The house had been empty for a long time, and when I first toured it, I felt an odd chill in the air, but I brushed it off as the old building settling. I'd been looking for a home for months, and when I saw this place, I knew it was where I had to be. The price was a steal, especially for a house with so much space, and I quickly signed the lease. I moved in the next week, eager to start a new chapter of my life in the quiet suburbs. The first few days were pleasant enough. I spent my evenings cleaning, organizing, and trying to make the house feel like my own. But as night fell, things started to change. The atmosphere in the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets. Secrets that were too old to be forgotten, but too strong to be ignored. It was the sounds that first alerted me. At night, when I lay in bed trying to sleep, I could hear faint footsteps, like someone was walking around the house. It wasn't a creak or a groan from the house settling. It was distinct, rhythmic, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I would sit up in bed, straining to listen, but the sounds would stop the moment I tried to investigate. The house was always still when I checked. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that the house was just old and had its quirks. Maybe the floors were uneven, or the wind outside was causing the noises. But as the days went on, things only got worse. One night, I woke up to the distinct sound of whispering. It was soft at first, almost inaudible, but as I strained to hear it, the words became clearer. Leave now." I sat up straight in bed, my heart racing. I had no idea where the voices were coming from. There was no one else in the house, and yet the voices felt so close, like they were in the room with me. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and scanned the room. There was no one there, just the dark corners of my bedroom. The whispering continued for a few moments, then stopped, leaving only silence in its wake. The next day, I did some research about the house. It hadn't been sold in decades, but the rumors surrounding it were enough to make me feel uneasy. The house was said to be haunted by the ghost of a woman named Eleanor, who had died in the house under mysterious circumstances many years ago. Some said she had been murdered by her husband. Others claimed she had taken her own life. No one knew for sure, but everyone agreed that her spirit had never left. That evening, I tried to talk myself out of the fear that had settled in my chest. I couldn't let the rumors control me. I was going to stay, and I wasn't going to let a ghost scare me away. But as I sat down for dinner in the dining room, the air in the house grew colder. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath misting in the air. I stood up, shivering, and went to the thermostat, only to find that it was set to a comfortable temperature. I tried turning the heat up, but nothing changed. The cold lingered, seeping into my bones. That night, things took an even darker turn. I had been lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard a faint knock on my door. 3 soft knocks, one after the other. At first, I thought it was a trick of my imagination, but then the knock came again, this time louder. I got out of bed, my feet cold on the hardwood floor, and approached the door. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what I would find on the other side. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. The house was silent, too silent. I stepped into the hallway, scanning the darkness, but there was no one there. The air felt thick with an invisible presence, and I quickly retreated back into my bedroom, locking the door behind me. The next day, I decided to leave the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone. I packed a bag and left for a hotel, thinking I could come back after I calmed down. But the moment I stepped outside, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one there. The street was empty, the air still. I rubbed my shoulder, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. But the cold lingered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I felt a constant presence in the room with me, as if someone was standing just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling only grew stronger. I couldn't escape the sense that something was wrong. The next morning, I went back to the house. I knew I couldn't keep running from it. As I entered the front door, I was greeted by an overwhelming sense of dread. The house was darker than usual, the air thick and oppressive. I walked through the rooms, feeling like I was being followed. It wasn't until I reached the basement door that I felt a sharp pull, an almost magnetic force urging me to go down. I hesitated, but something inside me knew I had to see what was down there. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The air was musty, and the smell of decay hit me like a wave. I reached for the light switch, but before I could flick it on, I felt a chill brush against my neck. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but once again, I was alone. I turned on the light, and what I saw took my breath away. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and cobwebs. But in the corner of the room, something caught my eye. A large mirror stood against the wall, its glass cracked and dirty. As I walked toward it, I could see the reflection of the room behind me. But when I looked closer, I saw something else, someone standing in the reflection. It was a woman, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and long, dark hair. Her lips curled into a twisted smile as she stared at me. I froze, unable to look away from the reflection. The woman's eyes seemed to burn into mine, and her lips parted, whispering something that I couldn't hear. In a panic, I turned around, but there was no one there. I rushed up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I didn't look back as I fled the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I never went back to that house on Elm Street. I couldn't bring myself to. It was as if the house had a pull on me, like it was calling me back, but I wasn't going to listen anymore. I found another place to live and made sure to stay as far away from Elm Street as possible. But every so often, I still feel it. The cold hand on my shoulder, the whisper in the dark, and sometimes in the mirror, I see her watching me. I know now that some houses hold on to the past, and some spirits refuse to leave. And I fear that no matter how far I go, the house on Elm Street will always be there, waiting for me to return. This is the end of Story 10. Story 11. I had always been drawn to the wilderness. Growing up, I spent every summer camping in the forests near my childhood home. The tranquility, the sense of adventure, there was nothing quite like it. As an adult, I continued the tradition, seeking the solitude and peace that the woods always seemed to offer. One weekend, I decided to take a solo hiking trip into the Silent Woods, a dense forest about 2 hours north of where I lived. The name was ominous, but I had heard nothing but good things from those who had ventured there before. The forest was known for its breathtaking views, winding trails, and quiet, serene atmosphere. It was the perfect place to escape the stress of work and reconnect with nature. I arrived at the trailhead around noon and packed my gear: a sleeping bag, food, water, a map, and my trusty compass. I was prepared for a weekend of solitude and peace, or so I thought. The first few hours were wonderful. The trees towered above me, their thick canopies casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The only sounds I could hear were the chirping of birds and the crunch of leaves underfoot. But as the day wore on, something began to feel off. The silence of the woods was deeper than I had expected. There were no sounds of rustling animals, no distant calls of other hikers. The air was thick with a stillness that made my skin crawl. I chalked it up to the fact that I was in a remote area, far from any civilization. Still, there was an unease that gnawed at me. As I continued along the trail, I stumbled upon an old wooden cabin, half hidden by the underbrush. It looked abandoned, with ivy crawling up the sides and the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the cabin. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dusty interior. The furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust, and a musty smell hung in the air. It looked like no one had been there in decades. I wandered through the cabin, trying to make sense of its presence in the middle of the woods. There was nothing particularly sinister about it, but something about the place felt wrong. The silence was unnerving, almost as if the house had been waiting for me. As I stepped into the kitchen, I found an old journal sitting on the counter. It was worn and weathered, the pages yellowed with age. On a whim, I flipped it open. The journal belonged to a man named William, someone who had spent time living in the cabin decades ago. The entries were vague at first, detailing his peaceful life in the woods. But as I read on, the entries became more disturbing. William began to write about strange occurrences in the forest, disembodied whispers, fleeting shadows, and the overwhelming sense of being watched. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. They are waiting for me. I can hear them outside the cabin. The trees are alive. I quickly closed the journal, my heart racing. The woods had always been peaceful to me, but reading about William's experiences filled me with dread. I shoved the journal back on the counter and left the cabin, hoping to shake off the feeling of unease. The sun began to set as I made my way further into the forest, the trees growing denser, the shadows longer. I knew I had to find a campsite soon, so I set up my tent near a small clearing. The night air grew colder, and the silence of the woods pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. I tried to shake off the unsettling thoughts, but as I sat by my campfire, the sense that something was wrong grew stronger. That night, I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, just a whisper, too quiet to make out the words. But it was there. I listened closely, straining to hear. The whispering continued, growing louder, as if it was moving closer. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area around me, but there was nothing, just the dark, towering trees and the flickering light of my fire. I convinced myself it was the wind, the rustling of leaves. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Help, help me." I froze. The voice sounded like a woman's, weak and distant. I stood up, heart pounding, and called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" There was no answer, only the same whispering, now unmistakably pleading. "Please, help me." I grabbed my things in a panic, deciding I couldn't stay in the woods any longer. As I gathered my gear, the whispering seemed to come from all directions, swirling around me like the wind. My breath came in ragged gasps as I bolted from the clearing, back toward the trailhead, hoping to escape whatever was haunting the forest. The darkness of the woods seemed to close in around me. I stumbled through the trees, my flashlight flickering as I moved. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was inside my head. "You can't leave," it said, the voice now a chorus of whispers, overlapping and indistinct. "You belong here." I was almost running now, desperate to get out, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before me. The trail, which had been clear and easy to follow just hours ago, now seemed to twist and turn in ways I didn't remember. My compass was useless, spinning wildly in every direction. And then, I saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the trail. A woman, her face pale and twisted with terror. She was staring at me, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. She raised her hand slowly, pointing toward the trees behind me. I couldn't move, paralyzed by fear, and I heard the whispering again, louder than ever. She will never leave. The woman's lips curled into a grotesque smile, and I realized she was not alone. Behind her, I could see the shapes of figures emerging from the shadows. Tall, thin shapes, their features indistinct, but their eyes glowed with an unnatural light. I turned and ran. The forest seemed to close in on me as I sprinted through the trees, branches clawing at my skin. The whispering followed me, relentless, maddening. I could feel the presence of something chasing me, but when I dared to look over my shoulder, there was nothing there. Only the dark, silent trees. Eventually, I collapsed, exhausted and terrified, in the middle of the trail. I don't know how long I lay there, trembling, but when I opened my eyes, the whispering had stopped. The woods were silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, deafening, suffocating. I forced myself to stand and stumbled back toward the trailhead. When I finally reached the road, I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was in my car, speeding away from the silent woods, the whispers still echoing in my mind. I haven't returned to the woods since that night. I don't know what it was that followed me, or what it wanted, but I know one thing for sure. Some places, some woods, are better left untouched. There are things in the forest, things that wait in the silence, things that can never be escaped once they've found you. And the whispering woman will always be out there, waiting for the next traveler to pass through the silent woods. This is the end of Story 11. Story 12. When I first moved into the old Victorian house on Oak Avenue, I wasn't expecting much. The house was large and imposing, but it had a charm that drew me in. It was a fixer-upper with creaky floors, overgrown ivy creeping up the sides, and windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. The price was right, though, and I figured with some effort, it could become the home of my dreams. I'd been living in the house for a few weeks when I first noticed the attic. I hadn't thought much of it before. The door was tucked away at the end of the hallway, obscured by a stack of boxes and old furniture. But one evening, as I was unpacking, I stumbled upon it. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty space filled with old trunks and forgotten relics. Curiosity got the best of me, so I climbed the narrow stairs, my flashlight casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. The attic was cramped and poorly lit, but there was something oddly inviting about it. It smelled of dust and decay, but I could also detect the faint scent of something floral. It seemed out of place in the otherwise stale air. As I moved deeper into the attic, I came across an old portrait hanging on the far wall. The frame was heavy, gold, and intricate, its edges chipped and worn with age. The painting itself was of a woman, a strikingly beautiful woman with dark, almond-shaped eyes and long, flowing hair. She wore a pale blue gown, and the expression on her face was one of quiet contemplation. At first glance, she looked almost lifelike, her eyes appearing to follow me as I moved around the room. I stood in front of the portrait, mesmerized by it. There was something about her, something that pulled me in. Her gaze seemed so intense, as if she were trying to communicate with me from beyond the canvas. It wasn't just the beauty of the painting that caught my attention, but the sheer lifelike quality of it. I couldn't explain it, but it felt as though the woman in the painting was alive, watching me. I didn't think much of it at the time, other than to admire it as a beautiful piece of art. But that night, as I lay in bed, something about the portrait gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen her before. It was an odd thought. After all, I had only just discovered the portrait that afternoon, but the woman's face seemed so familiar. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the feeling lingered, persistent and unsettling. The next few days were uneventful, but I couldn't escape the thought of the portrait. Each time I passed the attic door, I felt drawn to it, as though something in the room was calling to me. Eventually, I gave in to the pull and made my way back up to the attic to take another look. When I stepped into the attic that evening, I immediately noticed something was different. The air felt colder, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper. The portrait, which had been hung on the wall before, now seemed to stand out more. Its colors richer, the details sharper. As I moved closer, I realized that the woman's expression had changed. She no longer looked peaceful or contemplative. Her lips were curled into a faint, unsettling smile. Her eyes, which had once been calm and distant, were now filled with something darker, something I couldn't quite identify. I was about to turn away when I heard a soft rustling noise behind me. It was faint, but unmistakable, like someone was shifting their weight just out of sight. I spun around, my heart racing, but the attic was empty. I was alone. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and turned back to the painting. The woman's smile had widened, and her eyes seemed to gleam with malice. A chill ran down my spine, and I suddenly felt as though the room was closing in on me. I needed to leave, to get away from the attic, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as though the portrait had somehow frozen me in place, its gaze locking me into the room. That's when I heard it, the soft, almost imperceptible whisper, "Help me." I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The voice was unmistakable. It was soft, desperate, as though the woman in the painting was speaking directly to me. I tried to move, to escape the attic, but I couldn't. My feet felt like they were rooted to the floor. "Help me," the voice whispered again, this time louder, more urgent. I managed to tear my eyes away from the painting, and with a sudden burst of panic, I bolted toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I felt a cold hand grip my wrist. It was icy, almost as if I had been touched by a shadow. I yanked my arm away, but the cold lingered, spreading up my arm like a crawling vine. I didn't look back as I rushed out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could still hear the voice in my mind, echoing in the silence. "Help me." For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The house seemed to grow colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, as though the walls themselves were alive with a malevolent presence. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. The portrait, the whispering voice, it had all become too much. I spent the next few days avoiding the attic. I didn't dare go near it, but the unease lingered. The house had changed. It wasn't the same as it had been when I first moved in. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in on me, suffocating me with their silent whispers. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the pull of the portrait grew stronger. Each time I passed the attic door, I felt the weight of its gaze on me. I couldn't escape it. Eventually, I gave in once more, telling myself that I had to face whatever was haunting me. When I entered the attic again, the portrait was waiting. But this time, the woman's face was different. She was smiling now, a wide, twisted grin that seemed to stretch beyond what was possible for a human mouth. Her eyes, once cold and empty, now gleamed with a fiery intensity, as though they were alive. And then, for the first time, she spoke. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice sweet and honeyed, yet dripping with an unnatural cold. I couldn't move. It was as though her voice had taken control of my body, guiding me toward the painting. The closer I got, the more I could feel her presence. Her icy breath on the back of my neck, her fingers brushing against my skin. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't tear myself away. With a final, desperate cry, I broke free of the trance and stumbled back from the painting, gasping for air. I didn't look back. I ran out of the attic and slammed the door shut, my pulse racing. But even as I stood there, breathing heavily, I could still hear her voice, soft and insistent, lingering in the corners of my mind. "Help me." I don't know who or what that woman was, or why she called to me. All I know is that I never went back to that attic again. The house was no longer a home. It was a prison, and the portrait was its warden. To this day, I don't know what happened to the woman in the painting, but I have a feeling she's still waiting, watching, calling to the next person who dares to step into the attic of that cursed house. This is the end of story 12. Are you ready to uncover more dark mysteries with beautiful rain sounds to help you sleep? Hit that subscribe button and join us for more chilling stories, mysteries, and thrilling adventures with rain sound for a perfect sound sleep.